Hello, thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. Chairman Kim Jong-un taps Lee Sun-kwon, former chairman of the Committee for the Peaceful Reunification of the Country of DPRK, as North Korea's foreign minister. The State Department on North Korea's new appointment emphasizes leader-to-leader commitment and the documentation of the denuclearization agreement. Today, we discuss the potential impacts of denuclearization talks with the new personnel appointment.
We may be compelled to seek a new path for defending our sovereignty and supreme national interest.
My hope is that they're not talking about moving away from that agreement that was reached between President Trump and Chairman Kim in 2018.
In the studio with me today is Mark Tokola, Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Mr. Tokola had served as Deputy Chief of the Mission at the American Embassy in South Korea. Also joining me is Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Welcome to the program. Now, Mr. Snyder, I want to ask you, Lee Sun-kwon is a former senior military officer and has a lot of experience dealing with South Korean negotiators, but not really dealing in terms of U.S. officials. Why do you think he was appointed to this spot?
Well, I think that now Foreign Minister Ri, his appointment really reflects the outcome of the party plenum documents. And what we see there is an emphasis on retrenchment, an emphasis on self-reliance, an expectation that sanctions are not going to be removed anytime soon. And so it's possible to pick somebody who's more internally focused. The other big thing about Lee Sun-kwon is that he has a prior relationship with Kim Young-chul. And of course, last year what we saw was a debate post-Hanoi about whether the Kim Young-chul line was going to stay in charge of relations with the U.S., or whether it would switch back to the foreign ministry. And I think in some ways this question is answered. Kim Young-chul's influence, I think, is more likely to be felt with the appointment of Lee Sun-kwon.
So, Mr. Tokola, as Scott mentioned, we've seen a very hardline stance message from the party plenum in December. So what message is North Korea trying to send out with this appointment?
I'm not sure they're sending a message with the appointment. It may be for internal purposes. It may be reshuffling of people that Kim Jong-un wants to have by his side. So I think there's some danger in overinterpreting what's messaged by appointment. It can be marginally helpful to understand the background and behavior of a particular negotiator. But I think we shouldn't overinterpret that as meaning any change in policy. The most important thing is if Kim Jong-un is appointing somebody he trusts to negotiate, that'd be good news, no matter who the person is.
So what about the role of Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee? I mean, she has been the North Korea's main key nuclear negotiator. Do you think there will be any role change of Madam Choi?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the critical question there is really what is the relationship between Choi Sun-hee and Lee Sun-kwon? And I think that's an open question. There's also the return of the North Korean ambassador to Russia to take charge of the party role in the International Liaison Department position. And we don't know yet how that might influence policymaking as well.
But at the end of the day, isn't Chairman Kim making the final call in terms of making policy decisions and strategic decisions?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, basically, Lee Sun-kwon is the messenger. He's not going to be the architect of policy in North Korea. And so we have to recognize that that is the case. We deal with who is put forward if they're actually willing to deal with us.
So, Mr. Tokola, a State Department official has said that they were aware of these reports of Lee Sun-kwon being tapped to a foreign minister, and they emphasized leader-to-leader commitment, and they called on North Korea to resume diplomacy. So, do you think, with the new foreign minister in place, that North Korea is going to come out to talks?
We don't know that. I mean, we really don't know what North Korea is going to do next. The most important thing is that there be working-level talks. I mean, whether there's a Trump-Kim summit again or not, the key thing is that we be able to negotiate with people other than just the leaders. But any nuclear agreement is going to be long and complicated. The Iranian JICPO is over 100 pages. Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump cannot negotiate a 100-page document. So we need to get some empowered negotiators. And the good news is that on the U.S. side, I think Steve Biegun has been tapped as someone that actually can negotiate on behalf of the U.S. And this is a good development. Now we need to see if there's a North Korean counterpart.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that they're going to come out for talks?
Well, I think that the signals that we've been getting since Stockholm may be that the North Koreans are actually focusing longer term, and that on the near term they're kind of closing up shop, perhaps waiting to see who is going to be leading the United States policy in spring of 2021. That's very consistent with the message of retrenchment and self-reliance, and really an expectation or signal that was sent in the party plenum documents that don't expect any breakthrough in the near term. It's going to take time. We're going to try to hunker down and kind of wait and see what happens. Now, if President Trump makes an offer that is too good to be true, I'm sure the North Koreans will open the door crack and be willing to collect that gift. But I think that their main focus is on trying to get through 2020 and prepare for 2021.
Mm-hmm. So there have been a lot of analysis of how the U.S. presidential election factor is going to make North Korea take a wait-and-see approach. So, Mr. Tokola, do you agree with Scott that this impasse is going to continue for the time being until the elections are over?
It could work either way. I mean, because the elections, they may decide that they should wait for the next administration, if there is one, after November, or see if the president's reelected. Or they may be thinking they need to negotiate while President Trump is still in office, because he would be a flexible negotiator, from their point of view. The next administration could be harder. So it may be that some of this is posturing. They don't want to look desperate going into talks. They may be talking about self-reliance, patience. They could wait. That may be setting the stage for a movement. We don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, the North Koreans really have the best opportunity that they've ever had with President Trump to be able to cut a deal with the United States. It's hard to imagine actually going forward that the situation is going to get any better for North Korea. And yet, strangely, we don't see public evidence of that reflected in North Korean policy. It doesn't mean they're not thinking about it, but at present, I agree, they really want to make sure that they go into any kind of engagement with the U.S. from a position of strength.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they have been quiet, but I think it was partly because of the shock of Hanoi. I think they went to Hanoi expecting to have a deal. It didn't happen. I think there's a long period in Pyongyang of reassessment and trying to understand what happened there, prepare for the next stage.
But we continue to see message from North Korea saying that they're no longer compelled by the nuclear and ICBM testing moratorium, and that they're going to go its new way. They've been continuing to talk about this new way since last year. So what exactly is this new way they're talking about?
Well, I kind of feel like the new way is the old way, going back to Byungjin, kind of focusing on simultaneous economic development and military development, a national security first policy. But so far, not yet provocations. I mean, the long-awaited Christmas gift has not arrived. It could be stuck in the mail. We don't know. So I think that it's actually very notable that the North Koreans, for all of the focus on an end-of-the-year deadline, have kind of gone quiet. And so we really need to dig in and understand why that is the case.
I think for North Korea, shifts of policy are also important signals, not just what they do in terms of testing. And the fact they've talked about the moratorium no longer binding doesn't necessarily mean they're going to test. They have to be calculating that if they do a major provocation, ICBM or atmospheric test or even a large nuclear test, it may make it very difficult to engage the next U.S. administration. So if they're looking past President Trump towards what may happen after November, I don't think they want to set a stage that would make it very difficult for the next administration to engage with them. A major provocation would cause that problem.
Scott, you've earlier said that North Korea may continue this deadlock for the time being until the U.S. presidential election ends. So do you think that North Korea is going to, I guess, continue with some kind of lower level provocations rather than crossing the red line, like Mr. Tokola said?
So with regard to provocations, I think the critical issue is what is the ceiling beyond which North Korea cannot go. President Trump has not set the ceiling, but I do think that the Chinese support remains important. And so that means that the ceiling for North Korean provocations is in the hands of the Chinese. And what I think that we don't necessarily know clearly is what the Chinese might have signaled to the North Koreans about what they will not tolerate in late November and December as the situation seemed to be ramping up and as North Korea was really preparing the world for some kind of additional action. Now, the problem on the North Korean side is that provocations are necessary to generate a perception in the United States that time is not on our side. So it is important as related to positioning for a possible negotiation. And it's also important from a national prestige perspective.
So do you think that China's role is important in bringing North Korea back to the table? How important is this?
Important, but not deciding. I don't think that the road to negotiating Pyongyang runs through Beijing. I think there's a lot of mutual distrust between Pyongyang and Beijing, too. I think Beijing has some influence, but we shouldn't assume that they can dictate policies. I think Scott's right. They can draw some red lines. And they're helping North Korea with food aid, for example, is a useful tool of maintaining relations. But we shouldn't overestimate China's ability to influence Kim Jong-un.
And how can we break this impasse then?
I'm not sure that the denuclearization in exchange for sanctions relief is a big enough negotiating framework to work. I think we probably need to have a different kind of dialogue with North Korea. I think we could talk about conventional weapons. We could talk about having North Korea join the International Chemical Weapons Convention, the CWC. We could talk about more humanitarian aid, medical aid, agricultural assistance. There's lots of things we could talk about North Korea other than this denuclearization for sanctions. That seems to be an impasse.
Well, North Korea doesn't seem to respond to anything that are not sanctions relief. So do you agree with this view?
Well, I think that's a very interesting perspective. It's true that the U.S. has been very denuclearization focused. And it is hard, I think, for people in Washington to conceive of progress with North Korea without denuclearization. But of the issues that Mark raised, I personally think that the conventional arms reduction talk issue is the most interesting one, because the North Koreans had signaled back in November their frustration with joint exercises. And exercises were not part of the Singapore agreement. And so I think that there's space to propose a dialogue separate from implementation of the Singapore declaration to address precisely that issue of tension reduction, confidence building on the military side, that could get at some of those issues that the North Koreans have expressed concern about, but would actually be outside the context of some of the sanctions issues or some of the denuclearization expectations.
Yeah, I agree. That does not mean dropping denuclearization as being the basic goal. That should be the most important point. But you could make it a long-term goal and work on other things along the way.
No, that's right. I mean, conventional arms reduction could be an entree to get back to denuclearization, a kind of pre-step to actually implementing the Singapore Declaration.
So I guess an important message to look at from North Korea is next month's Munich Security Conference, where a North Korean official is going to attend. So,
well, it's important that the North Koreans are showing up, but I think we've seen a lot of international meetings of that sort where the hopefully right people are at the meeting, but then somehow they don't connect. And so I think that we have to wait, or the people who show up at the meeting aren't authorized to talk. And so it's not just showing up. We also have to have an environment in which it's actually possible for the two sides to have a constructive exchange with each other.
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment. Let's now watch a video for our next topic.
대북 정책은 대한민국의 주권에 해당된다는 점을 다시 한번 강조해서 말씀드리고자 합니다.
After South Korea's President Moon Jae-in called for economic exchanges with North Korea, South Korea is pushing for individual travel to North Korea and inter-Korean railway projects. The U.S. says it supports inter-Korean cooperation and consults through the U.S. ROK working group to ensure inter-Korean cooperation proceeds in lockstep with progress on denuclearization. So I want to first touch upon the State Department's comments on inter-Korean cooperation. After Seoul's nuclear envoy met with U.S. Deputy Secretary Biegun, it said it supports inter-Korean cooperation and that inter-Korean cooperation should go in lockstep with denuclearization progress. Now, this is a little different because before, the State Department has emphasized the implementation of UN sanctions. So do you think that the two sides may have reached some kind of an understanding here on this issue?
Well, it's clearly an active topic of conversation at the official level between the United States and South Korea. I actually think what's important is that the Moon administration, at the very beginning of all of this process in March of 2018, in advance of the Panmunjom summit, stated that one of the lessons of the past was that inter-Korean dialogue and the U.S.-North Korea relationship should proceed in parallel with each other. And so in that sense, I think that the State Department statement is actually a reaffirmation of a principle that the Moon administration had already designated as a first principle for engaging with North Korea. Now, the Moon administration, from Moon's New Year's Day speech, is clearly looking for ways to engage with the North. And the real question is whether the North Koreans are willing to respond. This is a kind of carrot. It's one where I think the Moon administration feels that the North Koreans think that South Korea owes them something based on the conversations that took place in September of 2018 in Pyongyang. But it's really hard to have many expectations because with regard to tourism, it goes back to 2008. And there was a killing of a South Korean housewife who was a tourist, and the North Koreans have never apologized or dealt with that issue. And so that's actually the core issue. Basically, Seoul should be spending a lot more time trying to talk with Pyongyang on this and less time talking with Washington on it.
You're right. Scott's mention of the issue of security concerns is a fundamental issue that South Korea must tackle in order to grant these individual travels to North Korea. So how do you think South Korea can actually work on this issue? And do you think that South Koreans will be willing to go to North Korea without this issue being settled?
I think Scott's right. North Korea needs to make the move. They need to say something about the incident from earlier, the killing of the South Korean tourist. Whether it's some form of, not even an apology, but just a statement that we will assure security, something. North Korea needs to address the issue.
And importantly, we haven't seen North Korea's response in terms of South Korea's proposal for individual travel. We did see Chairman Kim Jong-un saying that South Koreans are welcome to visit the Mount Kumgang tour last year when it called on the South Koreans to remove their facilities from the tourism project. Is this the kind of forum that North Korea wants to see in terms of travel?
Well, tourism, I think, based on what we see between China and North Korea, tourism is welcome in Pyongyang. Lots of Chinese going. I'm sure that the North Koreans would also like to see that resume with South Korea because it's a revenue generator. And that brings up the other issue that is really behind the scenes on this, and that is the purpose of sanctions is to squeeze North Korea, especially in terms of cash flow, but tourism is a way of relieving that pressure. And I think that probably the U.S. government, generally speaking, is not enthusiastic about measures that would be taken by allies that would serve to undermine the pressure that the U.S. is trying to put on North Korea.
Mm-hmm. And another point of contention is that concerns of possible sanctions violations in terms of individual travel. So what are some of the areas, what are some of the issues that the two sides must discuss on in order for this to happen?
Yeah, on sanctions in general, I think I would say that the sanctions are tough, and that's what we designed them to be. And then we in the United States and South Korea and our allies, we all designed sanctions to the UN to make sure the countries that were less interested in enforcing them would have a hard time to find loopholes. And so if we're finding it hard ourselves to find the loopholes, it's because this is what we intended sanctions to be, difficult to get around. And so we need to think through together how to phase out sanctions if the time comes.
Mm-hmm.
Tourism is not a sanctioned sector under UN Security Council resolutions. The transfer of funds is a big challenge. I think that it's possible to imagine that there would be ways to provide North Korea with credits rather than cash that could be applied to other transactions between the two Koreas. But the South Koreans are in a fundamentally different position as an ally of the United States and really in light of the history of Mount Kumgang from the position that the Chinese are in. And they have different policy objectives and different goals. And so I know that probably one of the big push factors in South Korea is, well, the Chinese are doing it, we're losing influence in North Korea, we've got to get back in.
Yeah, and if people-to-people ties are important, it'd be good to get back to family reunions. Because time is running out for those because of the aging nature of the families. That should be an emphasis.
Yeah. That's one of the actually areas that South Korea is pushing for.
Yes. Yeah.
And another sector that South Korea is pushing for is the inter-Korean railway project. So do you think that this is feasible? I know that South Korea is reportedly preparing a list of items that they want to bring into North Korea for the detailed research. How feasible is this at this point?
I think it's feasible. It's a question of whether it's desirable. And from the Moon administration's perspective, it obviously is perceived as desirable as a way of trying to get something going. I think from the U.S. perspective, it's not so desirable to move forward. There may be some things that could happen between the two Koreas, no violation of sanctions that would help in terms of planning, but even those actually require the North Korean demand signal in order for them to move forward.
Mm-hmm. And South Korea and the U.S. has established a working group back in 2018 to coordinate further cooperation on North Korea. Mm-hmm. So what kind of a role do you think that the two countries should play in these working groups at a time like this?
Oh, the working group is important because we need to have strong dialogue between Seoul and Washington. And people have used terms like green light from Washington. I don't like that term because I think this is a mutual activity. Neither side has a monopoly on wisdom about how to deal with North Korea. So we need to put our best thinking together. And doing it out of the public gaze is appropriate. It's a good idea. So I believe the working group is active. It should be.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree with President Moon's comment that these inter-Korean economic exchanges will expedite the denuclearization negotiations?
Again, I think there's a bigger issue at stake here. Even if every sanction is lifted, the North Korean economy is still fundamentally broken. I think there's a lot of room for discussion between Seoul and Washington on trying to think through what we would actually do to try to help the North Korean economy when the day comes that's possible. Sanctions aren't the key to it. The key is reforming North Korea's economy, which they should want too. So trying to think that through is a good bilateral activity.
I think as long as the North Koreans are postured in such a way that they're not interested in dialogue, there's not a cash means by which to grease the wheels if the wheels are not able to move.
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment. This week, we take a look at a North Korea YouTube account, Red Star TV. YouTube deleted the account earlier this month for failing to comply with all applicable sanctions and trade laws. But they're back, this time with Red Star TV, new. It's not the first time that YouTube deleted this account. One of the video clips we see is from North Korean TV, which the channel receives via satellite and then uploads from its base in Russia to YouTube. Scott, what do you make of this?
Well, I'm personally not very enthusiastic about YouTube being an intermediary determining what we can see from North Korea and what we can't. The North Koreans, it's true, are using YouTube as a way to put out what they want us to see, but frankly, we need to see as much as we can. And so for YouTube to make the decision, I think, is not ideal.
Mr. Tokola?
I agree with that. This is something that needs to be thought through because for YouTube, media is a commercial operation. For North Korea, it's a governmental propaganda operation. Those things don't necessarily match very well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Snyder. Thank you, Mr. Tokola.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk and from all of us here at Voice of America. Thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.